Climate extremists afraid debate. Maybe they should. Over 1,600 scientists declare there is no climate change emergency. For billions of human beings on the planet Earth, the "just stop oil" and "just stop fossil fuels" movements really do equate to "just stop life." No matter what the seemingly entitled, rich kid protesters may pretend to believe, the reality is billions of people the world over depend upon fossil fuels for their very survival. Period. Sadly, and quite dangerously, climate change has morphed from science to a religion for many on the left. Anyone questioning any aspect of the tenets of that newfound faith are branded heretics and excommunicated by the high priests of green energy. With the onset of COVID-19, we continually heard that the science is settled with regard to the virus, lockdowns, masking, school closures and mandated vaccines. Anyone daring to ask seemingly common-sense questions was labeled anti-science or an anti-vaxxer. Even doctors in the field and parents simply worried about the welfare of their children. Now, as climate change is being used as a catch-all explanation for a growing number of issues on Earth, some on the left are calling scientists who question that evidence and computer models, remember them as the drivers of the panic over COVID, climate dissidents, climate deniers, or worse. Last month, as recently reported in Real Clear Investigations, more than 1,600 scientists, among them 2 Nobel Physics laureates, Drs. John F. Clauser and Ivar Giæver of Norway, signed a declaration stating that there is no climate emergency, and that climate advocacy has devolved into mass hysteria. The skeptics say the radical transformation of entire societies is marching forth without a full debate, based on dubious scientific claims amplified by knee-jerk journalism. But for the high priests of climate change religion, the education and real-world experience of these scientists seemingly does not matter. Much like the 1939 movie, The Wizard of Oz, many on the left are screaming, "Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, pulling the levers that control the voice of the Great Oz. Listen only to the Great Oz." Today, the Great Oz of climate change does threaten to make life on Earth dramatically worse for billions of people, and no one is allowed to question his policies. Video Why? What are the green energy zealots so afraid of? The truth? No matter their refusal to debate, I still have a few questions for the Great Oz of climate change and his disciples. Is the mad rush to save the planet more about panicking the public and politicians into ceding more and more control to the high priests of climate change, again, much like the induced panic surrounding COVID-19, than it is about actual science? Are the Biden administration and the United Nations flat out lying to us regarding how much of the land in the U.S. must be sacrificed to build sustainable solar and wind farms which often dramatically underperform? Video Are we talking about a few 100,000 acres of land, or are we really talking about tens of millions of acres to get to the fictional net zero goal of having U.S. carbon emissions by 2035 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050? What happens to the tens of millions of wildlife species which live and depend upon those millions of acres for survival? What happens to the farmland and our food supply? What happens to the massive batteries and the toxic waste they produce? What happens if, and when, nations such as China, Russia, India and others simply ignore the net zero mandate? Wouldn't that make the U.S. and every other nation who followed the policy net zero chumps? For that reason, aren't a number of nations that signed on to the net zero goal now slow-walking or ignoring the policy because they believe it punishes their citizens of today? Today, the Great Oz of climate change does threaten to make life on Earth dramatically worse for billions of people, and no one is allowed to question his policies. Isn't much of the frenzy surrounding climate change really just an elaborate excuse by some on the left to kill the fossil fuel industry, no matter the real consequences for the billions of people and hundreds of thousands of employers who depend on fossil fuels for survival and to stay in business? There are more questions which can be asked of the high priests of climate change. But then, that is precisely the point. They don't want those questions asked. They don't want debate. They don't want investigations. They don't care about your opinion. They simply want to turn off the main source of power for the planet Earth and ask you to trust them. Or else.